What's up, y'all? This is Hammer here again, back with another video. First, I just want to say that sorry I have not been able to upload in a couple of days. As you guys already know, college life is back. The good news though is that this is my final year, so if everything goes well, if all of my credits are lined up properly, then I will definitely be graduating next spring with my undergraduate in computer science. But of course, senior year, so it's a lot of work. But nevertheless, I haven't forgotten about you guys, right? I just remembered that, oh my God, I haven't made a video in a while. But nevertheless, I wanted to hop on here and make a quick video about, a question that I think black people have kind of encountered. We've heard, especially from non-blacks, especially from whites, right? And I believe that I think in the past I made a video about how black people, don't want power, don't want respect. And I dive into that question too. But here I'm going to expand on that even more. And what I'm talking about is the fact that, growing up, especially here in America and the West, right? Something I used to hear something I will hear a lot is that, whites and non-black people will constantly, and I mean constantly, talk about how black people are low IQ, right? Why is it that they can't compete? And when they will say this, they're not just referring, because, a lot of times, we already know how black Americans have sort of become the face of the black diaspora. So when people say black, we immediately think, black Americans, but no. They mean globally. They mean, why is it that blacks in Africa are running around, failing, not doing good, blacks in the Caribbean, blacks everywhere, right? Why is Africa a shithole, right? So these are questions I will hear a lot, and I'm sure that black people get this question a lot, right? About, are black people low IQ, right? Why can't you compete? Why can't you get ahead? Why does it feel like every time you encounter a different group of people you get dominated? Why is that? Why is there that perception, right? And as for a very long time, I kind of ran from that question. I didn't want to touch it, I didn't want to address it. I think most black people would kind of just push it off as anti-black rhetoric. But what I'm gonna do in this video is I'm gonna do something that I haven't done actually in a while. Is I'm going to try and actually address that question the best I can, give my own theories, and because once again, guys, look, what I'm saying in this video is not going to be definite or absolute. This is just a theory I have, and you guys can of course chime in, the comments there and tell me whether you agree with my theory. If you don't, that's fine. But the whole idea is that I think instead of black people running from this question, this conversation, we actually need to take it on directly, right? So let's dive into it, right? Are black people, or as I say, right, or the Niger Congo group, / black Africans, black African descent, are these people, which I include myself in, are they low IQ? Now, looking at the fact that, the African continent, especially sub-Saharan Africa, has been dominated for so long, whether it's by the Arabs, by the Europeans, and how even after all this, they still can't seem to get their act together. One may look at the situation of the past couple hundred years, if not thousands of years, and come to that conclusion. But I have a different theory. I believe that black people, we are actually a product of our environment. And what do I mean by that, right? It is already established how, human behavioral patterns can be influenced by the environment in which people come from. And I believe that, when we look at peoples as a group, right, people groups, right, the culture they have and the sort of group behavioral patterns they showcase or showcase or represent can be a lot of times influenced by the environment that they come from. Let's look at Europeans, for example, right? The white man, right? Europeans came from an environment that, had a very harsh, very harsh environment. I'm like, people need to remember that, in many parts of Europe, they only had one growing season. So they had to think about the future. They had to think about, hey, if I don't plan ahead, if this harvest doesn't grow, I'm fucked, right? In many parts of Europe only had one growing season, right? Compared to Africa where it had multiple growing seasons, right? Many parts of Africa. Right. So one, Europeans came from an environment that had a much more harsher environment. Two, they came from an environment that had very low resources. And I believe coming from this environment, in my opinion, developed a group culture in which they have what I call a survival killer instinct, right? And when I say survival killer instinct, what I mean is that the survival killer instinct is when an individual or group of people, right, prioritize their survival over everything else, right? I call it survival or nothing. And when you have this mentality, when you have this group behavioral pattern of survival or nothing, this is going to make you more competitive. You're going to have a much more competitive mentality. And this is going to create this sort of drive and ambition towards power, towards dominance, towards doing whatever you can to get ahead, to be at the top, because all of that is in order for you to once again ensure your survival as an individual and as a group. And this creates a different mentality in a group of people or an individual compared to another group of people, right? Having a survival killer instinct, in my opinion, forces a group of people to progress. It facilitates your advancement because you have this mentality of survival or nothing. You're always doing whatever you can to be one step ahead, to dominate, to obtain power. And this mentality, this competitive nature is going to force you, is going to facilitate your growth as an individual, and it's going to facilitate your growth as a group of people. It's also going to facilitate your advancement as an individual and your advancement as a group of people. And what I'm trying to theorize here is you compare that compared to the environment that Black people came from, where they came from the environment where the environment was, was not harsh, right? In fact, it was pretty pleasant, right? Black people came from the environment where they had multiple growing seasons, right? They came from the environment in abundant resources. And so I believe that because of this, we were never able to really develop the same, what I call survival killer instinct that, Europeans did, right? When you live in an environment where it's not that harsh, there's a lot of resources, this is going to make you more of a docile people, okay? You're not going to care that much about your survival. You're not going to have that much of a competitive mentality. And you're not going to have this sort of drive and ambition towards power because, you live in an environment where you don't feel a need to. The environment is nice. There's a lot of resources, it makes you docile. And so it doesn't allow you, in many ways, because the environment makes you docile, right? Because the environment makes you docile, right? It in many ways stagnates your growth, right? Because you no longer have that sort of ambition and drive to dominate, that competitive mentality to advance, to always get ahead, to find solutions, right? That gets killed. That gets washed away because you don't live in an environment where you're comfortable, you feel docile, and that sort of killer survival instinct that will facilitate your growth and advancement is gone. And I do believe that, because Black people came from an environment where the environment was not as harsh, was more abundant resources, it did make us more docile. And because we became more docile, we became less competitive, We don't value us. We don't care about survival so much. We don't have the same, hunger and drive for power and dominance. And so this creates a situation in which we essentially stagnated. Right? We essentially stagnated, and it stunted our growth, and we were not able to grow and advance, and we didn't have the drive or ambition to grow and advance the same way people from Europe did, because of just how tough their environment was and just how many few resources existed there, right? And this phenomenon is not just unique to, I believe, blacks and whites, because remember, Europe and Africa are right next to each other, right? If you zoom out and you look across the globe, you see this everywhere, where for some reason, people who tend to come from environments that have a harsher, environment, right? People who tend to come from environments that are harsher, environments with fewer resources, tend to be more dominant on the world stage. What do we think of, Korea? We think of Japan. We think of China. We think of the Middle East, the Mediterranean, which really is just multiple European powers, like, for example, the Greeks, the Romans, who dominated the Mediterranean, the Turks, right? Same thing, right? What we look around the world, we see is that the people who have been able to dominate or rise to the top for the past couple of hundred thousands of years, people who come from areas where, either they had a harsher environment or they didn't have that many resources, right? Now, there are gonna be some exceptions, but overall, we do see this pattern. And on the other side, we see people who come from environments where the weather was not as hard, or the environment was not as harsh, and they had more abundant resources. We see how, for some reason, the growth stagnated. You think of the Aboriginals, right, in Australia. You think of the indigenous population in the Americas, right? Good environment, abundant resources, and once again, growth stagnated. The African continent, right? Niger Congo people, good environment, abundant resources, growth stagnated, right? So we see this everywhere. And I'll kind of explain in the beginning why I believe this phenomenon happens, right? People's behavior a lot of times can be influenced by their environment, right? The behavior pattern. If you essentially grew up, in a bad neighborhood, right, and you're trying to make it out, you're gonna have a certain drive and ambition inside you that somebody who was born with a silver spoon in the mouth is not gonna have. And I believe that people do grow, people do advance through adversity. And when you come from an environment where, you're not being challenged as much, you're surrounded by resources, right? You don't face as much adversity, right? You become comfortable. You become complacent, right? You don't have this mentality of survival or nothing. You lose your competitive mentality. You lose your drive and your ambition to grow, to move forward, to dominate. And this is what allows you to stagnate and become comfortable in your stagnation. And so I believe this is in my opinion, the reason why, not just why I think black people, in my opinion, find themselves in a situation where whenever they meet outside groups, they get dominated. But I believe it's also the reason why, when you zoom out globally, the people who tend to be the most dominant, whether it's the Japanese, the Chinese, or Europeans, even parts of the Middle East, come from areas where it's either a harsh environment or very few resources. It's because being from those environments developed and then a certain, behavioral pattern, which I call survival killer instinct, which allowed them to facilitate their growth, right, and advance as a people. The adversity from their environment, the challenges from their environment, created in them a sense of ambition, a sense of drive, a sense of survival or nothing mentality, a competitive mentality, which allowed them to advance and to grow as a people. Right? Right? They essentially grew through their they grew through their challenges. They grew through their challenges, right? Compared to those people who came from environment areas where the environment didn't challenge them, right? So that they didn't have that survival mentality, they didn't have that competitive mentality, they didn't have that drive and ambition of power or to grow. And so they became comfortable where they were. They this allowed them to stagnate, and they essentially became comfortable in the stagnation. Okay, and this is the reason why you see this phenomenon of people who come from areas with smaller resources, harsher environments tend to be ahead, and those who come from areas with all this great weather, great environment, abundant resources tend for some reason to in many ways have stagnated or to be behind, right? And I believe that this is where I think Black Africans, Black people find themselves in, is that we, in my opinion, are a curse of our, we are a curse of our environment, right? So now that the question then becomes, is that all there is to it? Well, no. I think, there is some benefit to coming from an environment where, it's not as harsh and, it's abundant in resources, is that it allows your culture to be more flexible. And what I mean by that is, like, for example, if you look, compare Europeans and Black Africans, right? Europeans have a much more rigid culture, right? For them, time is of the essence, right? Time for them is very important, right? Once again, because of the environment in which they came from and how this developed that sort of survival killer instinct, in them. This is what made them have a culture that's much more rigid and which time is of the essence. Now you compare that to Black Africans where because they came from an environment that was not as harsh and had a lot of resources, right? They didn't have a serial killer instinct, but this also meant that they developed a much more flexible culture. And which means that instead of them being rigid, I will say Black Africans are much more creative when it comes to how they express themselves, especially when it comes to dancing and music. Black people globally already have a reputation of being much more creative when it comes to music, when it comes to dances, right? And that largely is because we come from that environment where, hey, you got multiple growing seasons, right? It doesn't matter if this harvest fails, you got another one. So this allows your culture to be more flexible. This allows you to experience, to be much more fluid in how you do things. And this, in my opinion, creates sort of an artistic mentality, an artistic side to your culture. And I think that coming from that environment where, that environment where we had good coming from an environment that was not as harsh, multiple resources, right, allowed us to be much more flexible, which made us much more of an artistic people, okay? And so we are now much more artistic, much more creative in how we express ourselves in dance and in music. And you see this everywhere, right? Everywhere. We Black people already have that reputation compared to, when you come from an environment like Europe, where you sort of have to be more rigid, time is of the essence. You're not going to develop that sort of artistic side to yourself, right? Because look, in order for you to be artistic, right, you can't be rigid, right? You have to be flexible. So only by Black Africans, Black people having a more flexible culture, are they able to become much more of an artistic people. That's just the reality. So I think that's one benefit that we did get from coming from an environment where, where it wasn't as harsh and we had abundant resources, is that, it allowed us to have a much more flexible culture, which allowed us to develop a much more artistic side to ourselves, right? Because we were more flexible, it was easier for us to develop sort of this artistic instincts, right? It's in us. Black, we have it, right? It's in us, right? So that is at least, one beneficial point, right? But then the question then becomes, okay, that's fine, being artistic, having an artistic instinct as a group of people is fine when it comes to dancing and making music, right? But when it comes to power, it doesn't mean anything. So the question then becomes, where do Black Africans or Black people go from here? My thing is this. I have laid down my theory as to why I believe Black people are where they are. I think why they have, in my opinion, stagnated as a group on the continent. and why even now it seems like we can get our act together globally. And I think why, when we look across the world, people who tend to be on top tend to come from certain environments, tend to come from environments that have certain characteristics, right? They're either harsh or very low resources, right? So I've really laid that out. But I do believe that when it comes to Black people, the only way we can move forward is once, it's going to have to be the Black Africans on the continent that are going to have to kind of take charge. But also, number two, we're going to have to develop a survival killer instinct. We're going to have to, because that's what is needed for power. And I've already broken down, what that means and what comes with that, right? Being more competitive, putting your survival above everything else and having a drive towards power, right? The problem though is that a survival killer instinct is typically created in an individual group of people through the environment in which they're in, right? It's what I call a behavioral pattern, right? It's very difficult to instill into a group of people a behavioral pattern that is contradictory to the environment. Human beings are influenced by environment. If you're somebody who essentially grew up in a poor environment, you're gonna be influenced differently compared to if you grew up in a wealthy family. It's gonna be very difficult for you to be in a poor environment and have the same mentality, the same behavioral patterns as someone who grew up in a wealthy family. So that's the issue that we're facing, is that the sort of characteristics and sort of cultural the characteristics and the behavioral patterns that Black people need in order for us to start dominating, those are things that only our environment can give us. Only our environment can sort of create those behavioral patterns in us, right? It's going to be very difficult for us to impose on ourselves. Now, it can be possible, right? I believe that, with the advent of social media, with the advent of technology, we can use the power of social media and the influence it has on our mind and our subconscious to be able to slowly, I believe, circumvent the environment and I think cultivate that survival killer instinct through social media, by influencing people's minds and people's subconscious. It's very difficult. It's very hard, but I think it can be possible, right? I think it can be possible, right? You push it to social media, you get people to start thinking in that manner, right? You start having, because look, even on the African continent, right, there's a lot of young people who already consume content, right? If you look, for example, in West Africa, many of the anti-French protests in West Africa is being fueled by social media. So we've already known that with technology and with this new advent of social media, we can influence hearts and minds. And I believe that, we can use this possibly to circumvent the environment, possibly, which is very difficult, to go directly to Black people's heart and mind and sort of influence a sort of change in their behavior, influence and change in how they view things, view the world, and maybe even cultivate a sort of group behavioral pattern in which we start to have a survival killer instinct in which the same way, Europeans or other more dominant groups have. Now, it'll be very difficult, but I believe it is worth trying, and I believe that it can be done. Because as far as I'm concerned, that's the only way out. Because because outside of that, I don't see any other way how we can develop a survival killer instinct in an environment as abundant as Africa, right? An environment with the resources, are so abundant in Africa, with an environment where, the climate, the environment is not as harsh, right? The only way you can create that mentality, when with people living in that kind of an environment that is so pleasant and so abundant in resources, that you have to find a way to circumvent it. And I believe that using technology, using social media, going directly to people's hearts and minds, cultivating that mentality, in their heart, in their minds, in their hearts, and in their subconscious, can be done. because we've already talked about the influence social media can have on people's minds and stuff, right? So it can be done. It's very difficult. It's not foolproof, right? But I think that that's the only way forward, right? Because I personally believe that if black people don't develop the survival killer mentality, then our mentality won't change. Our mentality won't change, right? We are always going to have we're always going to have this docile mentality to grow people. Right, I've talked about this. How black people, we have this thing where we're always so loving, we're always so forgiving. That's everywhere, right? And we have to ask, where does that come from? Why is it that we're so loving as a group of people? Why is it that we're so quick to forgive? Because once again, these are behavioral patterns that we develop because of the environment we came from. And you can't just turn that off with a switch, right? In fact, earlier on in the video, I was talking about, how because Europeans come from an environment of where it's harsher, with little resources, right? It made them richer, but also for them, time is of the essence, right? Because in many parts of Europe, right, they only have one growing season. So if they miss, a harvest, they're fucked. So time becomes very important to them, right? Now compare that to Africans, to Black Africans, right? Black people we do have what I call colored people time, right? We time is not a themselves, right? Black Africans have a culture in which time is not of the essence, right? Time is not as rigid. In fact, it is a cultural thing to be late to things. It is cultural in Africa, right? Because I don't think I've noticed, but when you go to in Africa, right, it is very normal for you to come late to a wedding, for you to come late to, time is viewed differently amongst Black Africans, right? It's not viewed in a rigid way. In fact, one culture shock like that you will encounter when you go to the Black African continent is how much people just don't take time that seriously. You go to a wedding, they'll be late. They're making an appointment. So we see that even when it comes to the Black diaspora, they've inherited that behavioral pattern, right? Here in America, in the Caribbean, right? Black people globally have the same thing, right? We have that Black people, color people time. Late to things, but time is not of the essence. We don't view time the same way as those that come from harsher environments, right? Europeans view time in a rigid way. Black people view time in a much more flexible way. Hey, bruh, I'll just give me a more. I'll be there in a second, right? And he's still, taking a shower. It's the same thing, right? So that just shows you how powerful, environments can have, like the power, right, that environment can have over your behavior and the group's behavior. And the problem is that the behavior pattern that we've developed as a people, as a race, if you want to say it, right, as a people, from our environment is hurting us. It's making us less competitive. It's making us docile to a point at which we can't compete with other people. And in order for us to develop the sort of behavior patterns that we need, we have to in many ways circumvent our environment, which is going to be very difficult, right? And I personally believe that the only way I personally believe that's going to be very difficult to do. I feel that using modern day technology like social media and so that can allow us to circumvent that and go directly to Black people's, Black Africans' heart and minds, cultivate a sort of a new mentality within the mind, within the subconscious of a survival killer instinct, right? Which allows us to circumvent the environment in which we're in and sort of instill a new behavioral pattern within Black people in spite of the environment in which they came from, in spite of the environment that is not harsh and abundant in resources, right? I feel like that's the only way forward. Because outside of that, I feel like Black people are going to be cursed to having this behavioral pattern of being a docile people, and that's going to make us vulnerable, right? Make us vulnerable. Now, we do have an opportunity right now because due to the fact that This century, of course, is the Asian century. The next century is the African century, right? In which the center of the global economy is going to move from Asia towards Africa. I've already talked about why this will happen, right? It's more likely to happen because the way capitalism works is that capitalism is always going to expand for new markets, right? It's a promise of endless growth, right? It went from the West towards Asia. Once this centuries, once the Asian century, which is this century, comes to an end, right? Capitalism would have reached its limits of growth in Asia, and in order for it to keep growing, it will have to expand to new territories. And the only territory that has not been touched yet after Asia will be Africa. That you'll be the only one left, and so Africa is already being set up to be the final frontier of industrialization. So, Africa will be next in terms of global capitalism, right? In terms of industrialization, right? Because it has to be. And plus, sub-Saharan Africa is the only region in the globe that is growing demographically. The only region in the world that has sub-Saharan Africa, right? Black people, right, are the only people in the world right now that have a birth rate above replacement. So with you having a growing population, with you having a birth rate above replacement, with you being the final frontier of industrialization, right? It's almost inevitable that by 22,000, right? You essentially 20,000, right? Which is the next century, because this is 21,000, right? So by 22,000, you will essentially have your own century, right? 20,000, you will become the center of the global economy, right? The center of the global economy will move from Asia towards Africa, right? But once again, even though all of the trends, even though everything is to your advantage, right? You have to be ready. You have to be ready for this opportunity. And if Black Africans, are not ready, if they don't have the right mentality, they could end up fumbling that ball. If imagine playing a game of football, right? And that, hey, the QB, the quarterback, is gonna throw a pass to this specific individual, right? And you're going to intercept the ball. You know what's coming, you see it coming, and you're there. Even though all of the chances are in your favor, you still have to catch that ball. You have to be ready. If you touch that ball and you fumble that ball, it's over. So, even though all the trends and the pendulum is swinging towards the side of the Niger Congo people, they have to be ready when it comes. Otherwise, that if they miss this opportunity, they let this opportunity fall through the finger. I've said it before, the Black race may be over. Because we've already talked about the artificial womb and how these countries, if this birth crisis, if this population issue gets bad enough, they may just start using the artificial womb to start producing children. And at that point, your demographic advantage will matter. So, the opportunity is there, the pendulum is swinging to your favor, but Black Africans must be ready to take advantage. Otherwise, if they fumble this ball, then the Black race may never recover. And that's the reason why I feel like it is so important. It is so important for I think Black people to ensure that we shed this docile behavioral pattern that we have inherited from the environment in which we came from. Right? And I believe the only way this can be done is through the power of new technology, which I call social media, right? And being able to tap into people's hearts and minds, right? In order to sort of cultivate their mind, cultivate their heart, cultivate their subconscious, and instill in them a new behavioral pattern as a group. Through social media, right? Through the sort of new technology. It came possibly. Look, we have been shown how powerful media is. We've been shown how powerful this new tech is and how it influences people. I mean, think about how much, right, social media has been able to change the mentality when it comes to LGBT, when it comes to trans. I mean, if we've had studies done about how much social media can influence people's minds. So if that's the truth, I feel like this can be an effective tool to correct a flawed behavioral pattern that has made black people uncompetitive, right? Which I call a docile behavioral pattern. I think through social media, we can tap into hearts and minds on black people globally. Instill in them a survival killer instinct, right? By cultivating the mind, cultivating the heart, cultivating the subconscious, and essentially having them develop a new behavioral pattern, one in which that is predicated or based on a survival killer instinct, in which they have more of a competitive mentality, in which they prioritize survival over everything else, and in which they develop a drive and ambition for power. And I think once we do this, I think once black Africans or black people globally are able to shed our docile mentality of we gotta just stay back and learn forgive. Once we shed that docile mentality and adopt a much more survival killer instinct behavioral pattern, we will be not just more of a competitive group on the global stage, but I think we will be in a better position to take advantage of the 22nd century and the African century and ensure that we don't fumble the opportunity. With that being said, I think I'll leave it there. But you guys in the chat, tell me what you guys think. This, I think, in my opinion, is my thesis, my theory as to what I believe. In regards to the question as to whether black people low IQ. So I guess I'll go ahead and switch the question. No, black people not low IQ. We ironically are a victim and a product of our environment. We come from an environment that is not as harsh. We come from an environment that is abundant in resources, and it has developed in us a docile behavioral pattern, which has made us uncompetitive and put us in a situation in which whenever we sort of meet or compete with other groups of people, we always end up in a bad position. Not because we can't, but because we have not developed this sort of survival killer instinct that causes us to have a much more competitive mentality, that causes us to prioritize survival over everything else, that causes us to have an ambition and drive towards power. And because we did not develop that, and instead we developed a sort of docile behavioral pattern, this has made us in a weaker position whenever we compete or we go against or fight other groups. And I believe that through social media, we may be able to circumvent our environment and instill that survival killer instinct, to make us a much more strong group on the global stage, to make us better at competing with other groups, and to put us in a position where we will be better at sort of, taking advantage of the 22nd century and the African century, and us being the last frontier of industrialization, right? And so, no, we're not low IQ. We're simply a victim of our environment. And I believe that through modern technology, and through modern technology, and through various efforts, this can be overcome, right? But we will have to. It will be required for us to shed this docile behavioral pattern, and we know we have it. We know we have it, right? No other group can get abused the way black people do globally and still turn around and forgive. No other group can do that. That's how you know that we have a docile behavioral pattern. That's how you know that our behavioral pattern makes us weak and vulnerable for abuse, and has changed. So yeah, we are not low IQ. We're simply a victim of our environment, right? Which has made us docile, and I believe that through modern technology, it can be changed. With that being said, y'all, tell me what you guys think. Do you agree with my theory? And one thing, guys, look, this is not, I guess, guaranteed in stone. I'm just laying a theory out there that I've come up with, and you guys tell me whether you agree with it. If you want to add stuff to the theory, remove the theory. That's how we do things in life. Real intellectual people, will put out their thoughts, their theories, and they'll have individuals bounce out their thoughts. So these are my thoughts. Tell me what you guys think in the chat. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Are there aspects you think that I'm missing? Do you want to add other aspects to my theory? That's perfectly fine. But I believe that black people can no longer just keep running from this conversation and just tag it as racism because it is true that we are at the bottom of the hierarchy globally. It is true that for the past couple hundred years, if not thousands of years, whenever we encounter these non-black groups, not all the time, but a lot of the times, it doesn't end well for us. Whether it's the Arabs, the whites, so we do have to take on these statements. We have to take on these questions. So tell me what you guys think in the chat. Like, share, and subscribe. Hammer out.